Jasmine, Crockett, and Ted Cruz face off in a fiery congressional hearing as billions of taxpayer dollars are being funneled into failing private schools under the guise of school choice. With over 2,100 public schools shut down in just 5 years and millions wasted, Jasmine exposes the harsh reality. Children are being used as profit for private investors. As Cruz defends a broken system, Jasmine demands to know, if the system is weak, why keep pouring money into it? Will the truth finally come to light, or will the cycle of exploitation continue at the cost of our children's futures? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera panned across the marble columns of the Capitol, where sunlight cut through the dome like a divine spotlight. But inside, the air was thick with tension. A congressional hearing on federal education funding was underway, and every seat was filled. Reporters whispered into their mics. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire. Then came the name that split the room like a crack of thunder: Senator Ted Cruz. He entered with the swagger of a man certain he'd already won. Blue tie perfect, smile rehearsed. "I'm here," he began, "to defend freedom, especially the freedom of every parent to choose the best for their child." His voice rang with the weight of scripted conviction. "School vouchers," he declared, "are not threats to education. They're lifelines to opportunity." A handful of his allies nodded, but the rest of the room stayed dead silent. Seconds later, the double doors at the back of the room eased open. A hush fell. In stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her pace was steady, her jaw tight, her presence undeniable. She wore a deep blue blazer, not flashy, not soft, a color of command. As she made her way toward her seat, whispers darted like arrows through the chamber. One aide leaned into another. "She's not playing defense today." Crockett didn't acknowledge the chatter. Her gaze stayed fixed. Her seat waited, directly across from Cruz. She sat, spine straight, hands folded atop a thick file stamped in red. Education crisis, public loss, private profit. No words yet, but the weight of her arrival was unmistakable. She wasn't just representing a district. She was representing every child in America whose school closed while private academies raised tuition behind gated fences. The battle line was drawn, the air tightened, and the hearing had only just begun. The room was holding its breath, still heavy from Jasmine Crockett's silent arrival. Cameras tilted, pens paused midair. But Senator Ted Cruz didn't wait. He leaned forward, voice steady, practiced, and unmistakably condescending. "Let's stop pretending the public school system is some noble victim," he said, his words cutting through the chamber like a blade. "It's not under attack. It's collapsing under its own weight. And we're the ones letting it happen." He raised a hand, gesturing toward no one and everyone at once. "The truth is simple. Public schools fail because they have no competition. They don't need to improve. They don't need to listen to parents. They just keep getting money, year after year, no matter how poorly they perform." He let that sink in, eyes sweeping across the panel, daring someone to interrupt. No one did. Then he went in harder. "Take my home state of Texas," he said, his tone sharpening like a prosecutor delivering Exhibit A. "Private schools, many of them small, faith-based, community-rooted, are delivering better results across the board. Test scores are higher. Classrooms are quieter. Kids are graduating and going to college, not jail." He paused, letting the weight of that last phrase land. "Meanwhile, we keep pouring billions into public schools where violence is rising, teachers are quitting, and students are falling behind." Cruz turned slightly, eyes aimed toward the television cameras now, speaking not just to Congress but to the living rooms of America. "So why are we forcing parents, especially low-income families, to keep their children in these environments?" His voice dropped half a note, quieter but more intense. "They don't get to choose. They don't get to leave. They're trapped by zip codes and bureaucracy while the rest of us send our kids wherever we please." Then came the line that made a few in the audience audibly shift in their seats. "This isn't just bad policy. It's cruelty wrapped in tradition." His tone darkened just enough to feel performative. "If you had the money, you'd never send your child to those schools. So why do we insist the poor should?" The words echoed longer than he expected. There were no immediate shouts, no applause, just a low murmur, One part approval, one part discomfort. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her hands remained folded over the folder labeled Education Crisis, but her eyes had locked onto Cruz like a surgeon preparing for incision. She knew what he had left out. The budget stripped, the support staff fired, the libraries closed, the counselors gone, the heat shut off in classrooms that smelled of mold and sweat. She knew Cruz wasn't describing a natural failure. He was describing the end result of a system that had been bled dry, and now he stood there, blaming the victims. The silence after Cruz's speech was sharp, not a pause for reflection, but the edge of something about to break. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for a moment, her eyes trained on him like a surgeon reading a vital sign flatlining. Then she leaned slightly forward, not rushed, not flustered, controlled, surgical. Her voice, when it came, was low and calm, but carved with precision. "Choice," she said, as if testing the word for cracks. "That's a powerful word, Senator. You said it like it's universal, like it's guaranteed. But let me ask you, what choice does a family have when the only door you offer leads to a school they can't afford, can't access, and wouldn't be welcomed into even if they tried?" Her tone didn't rise, but the temperature in the room did. "What choice?" she repeated, firmer now. "When 78% of low-income families don't meet the entry requirements or can't afford the hidden costs of the very institutions you claim are lifelines?" She picked up a thin packet from her folder and held it between two fingers. This report, compiled by 3 education watchdogs, shows that most private voucher-accepting schools require application fees, mandatory interviews, parental involvement hours, uniform costs, transportation arrangements, and in many cases, church attendance. She dropped it flat on the desk. The sound was soft but final. "You're calling that choice? That's not a lifeline. That's a lottery where the house always wins and the poor always lose." Her voice never wavered, but her eyes were like coals catching flame. "You don't call it exclusion because the gate's technically open, but you surround it with requirements designed to push families out before they even get a foot in." She shifted in her chair, face steady but fierce, like someone who had carried too many stories from too many parents who couldn't afford another rejection letter. "And let's be clear, these aren't luxury extras. They're barriers dressed up as standards. And while those barriers go up, the public schools in my district, the schools that do take everyone, are bleeding staff, closing programs, and turning libraries into storage closets because of the very policies you're defending." She paused, scanning the room. "So again, I ask, what choice are we really talking about, Senator? Because from where I'm sitting, it's not a choice. It's a carefully constructed illusion that leaves our most vulnerable families out in the cold." Again. The tension in the room thickened, but Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her gaze was fixed, her tone colder now, measured, deliberate, like a surgeon walking toward a wound no one else dared to touch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into the folder before her and withdrew a thick, stapled packet, printed on plain government letterhead. The Department of Education seal glinted under the overhead lights. She held it up slowly, for the panel and the cameras. "Since we're talking about facts," she began, her voice low and controlled, "let's use real ones. Public, verified, impossible to ignore." She tapped the front page once with her finger. "This is a federal report, not opinion, not speculation, just numbers. Brutal, unavoidable numbers." Her eyes moved deliberately across the room, pinning each official in place. In the last 5 years across this country, 2,147 public schools have closed permanently, not paused, not consolidated, closed, gone. She paused, letting the words hit. That's over 2,000 communities that lost their only local school. Over 2,000 zip codes where children now wake up earlier, travel farther, and come home later, if they have anywhere to go at all. She took one step forward, laying the report flat on the table. And if you read the reasons, the most common thread isn't declining enrollment. It's not academic failure. It's not safety. It's funding. Her voice sharpened like glass under pressure. Funding redirected away from public schools into voucher programs, programs that send public money to private hands, with little oversight and even less accountability. She leaned slightly forward now, both hands braced on the table, voice steady but pulsing with moral urgency. Do you know what happens when a public school closes in a low-income neighborhood, Senator Cruz? That school wasn't just a classroom. It was a meal for kids who don't eat dinner. It was heating in the winter. It was the first adult to notice a bruise. It was the only counselor a depressed student would ever talk to. And now, it's boarded up, because the money meant to keep the lights on was handed to schools that never accepted those kids in the first place. She drew a breath, slow and deep, then finished with a voice like a blade. You didn't reform the system. You starved it, and then blamed it for dying. The silence from Jasmine Crockett's last line, you starved it, and then blamed it for dying, was still settling like smoke after an explosion. But she didn't give anyone time to breathe. Her voice came back sharper now, colder. The grief had shifted into something surgical. But let's be very clear, she said, reaching into the folder again. This wasn't just policy failure. This wasn't just ideological. She looked up, her eyes locked on Cruz. This was profitable. She turned and motioned to the digital monitor behind her. The screen flickered to life, revealing a sleek, meticulously detailed flowchart. It wasn't flashy. It was clinical. Black text, red arrows, gray boxes. But what it showed was devastating. Here, Jasmine said, stepping to the side so the camera could catch it, is how the voucher system moves money, not just away from public schools, but into political machines. She pointed to the first box labeled State Voucher Funds, then traced a red arrow to a second box labeled Private School Corporations. Her voice was steady, deadly. These are the schools receiving millions in taxpayer-funded vouchers, many of which serve fewer than 100 students and still report operating surpluses. She moved to the next link. Now follow this arrow, she said, tapping the thick red line that moved from those corporations to a third box. Educational Excellence Alliance. This foundation, she continued, has donated over $12 million in the past 4 election cycles, not to schools, not to communities, to political action committees, PACS. Then she let her finger land on the final box at the bottom of the chart. Liberty Learning PAC, $1.9 million to Ted Cruz, 2022 campaign. A few gasps rang out, not loud but sharp, like knives dragged across glass. Jasmine turned back to the panel. Her tone didn't rise, it didn't need to. So let's not pretend this is about the children, she said, each word crisp as ice. This is a feedback loop. Taxpayer dollars go to voucher schools. Those schools raise tuition, limit access, and funnel their excess to foundations. Those foundations fund PACs, and those PACs protect the very politicians who keep the voucher pipeline flowing. She paused, then glanced again at Cruz, not with anger but with clarity. You didn't just defend this system, you built it. And while the schools in my district are locking their front doors, your donors are cashing checks and calling it reform. The screen behind Jasmine Crockett still glowed with the hard, incriminating lines of the financial map. Names, arrows, PACs, all pointing toward one conclusion. But instead of responding with facts, Senator Ted Cruz leaned into something more practiced. Deflection wrapped in performance. He adjusted his cufflinks with casual precision, then leaned into the microphone with a condescending half-smile that told the audience he wasn't rattled. He was amused. There it is, he said, his voice smooth but dripping with theatrical fatigue. Congresswoman Crockett, the queen of distraction. His gaze never broke from her face, but he now spoke to the room as if she were no longer worth addressing directly. Every time she's confronted with data she doesn't like, she pivots, slides into some elaborate web of political dark money and corruption conspiracies. His hand gestured lazily toward the diagram still glowing behind her. It's a beautiful chart, but it's built on resentment, not reason. What she can't stand, he continued, letting the words sharpen, is that some families, when given the chance, are choosing to leave the system she wants to protect. He paused for effect, letting the sentence echo. Let's be honest, he added, leaning back with the confidence of a man reciting a well-used script. She's not fighting for equity. She's angry that some schools succeed without government control, that some students thrive in places she doesn't approve of, that some families, especially in working class and immigrant communities, want something more, and they're finally getting it. He sat forward now, hands clasped like a preacher at the pulpit. The real danger isn't failing schools. The real danger is one-size-fits-all thinking, bureaucratic arrogance, political conformity. That's what she's selling, dressed up as fairness. Then came the final blow, delivered with the sanctimony of a man who'd rehearsed it 100 times. Tyranny tells you where to go. Freedom lets you choose. That's what vouchers represent. Not corruption, not chaos. Choice. Choice. He let the word hang, polished, heavy, and hollow. The screen behind him still pointed in silence to the money trail he refused to see. The chamber still echoed with Cruz's closing line. Freedom lets you choose, like a bell rung in a cathedral. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't smile. She simply let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words hang in the air, long enough for everyone to hear how hollow they truly were. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but charged with something electric, controlled fury, rooted sorrow, unshakable truth. Freedom, she said slowly, as if testing the word herself. It sounds noble, it sounds patriotic, but let's not confuse the poetry of freedom with the practice of it. Her eyes moved across the room, not just toward Cruz, but to the other lawmakers, the press, the cameras, the families watching. Because freedom is just a beautiful word, unless you actually have access to it. Her voice didn't rise, but the tension in the room did. You can paint choice in red, white, and blue, but if the doors it leads to are blocked by application fees, transportation deserts, biased enrollment tests, and tuition gaps, then that's not choice. That's exclusion dressed up in democracy. She reached for a page in the report she had previously referenced and held it without reading. She already knew what it said. In the communities I represent, freedom doesn't come in brochures and policy slogans. It comes in questions like, can my kid walk to school safely? Will there be lunch if I can't afford groceries this week? Will the nurse be there on Monday when his asthma flares up again? Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from carrying too many stories that never made it to the floor of this chamber. When those basic questions go unanswered, your version of freedom becomes something else entirely, a weapon of privilege, a story told by those who never had to knock on a locked door. She looked directly at Cruz again, her words now precise and unrelenting. So no, Senator, don't tell me this is about freedom, because real freedom doesn't ask you to prove your worth before giving your child a future. Real freedom shows up for everyone. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's last line, real freedom shows up for everyone, had barely settled before she drew the room deeper into the numbers, into the quiet brutality that lived beneath the rhetoric. Her hand moved with quiet finality as she lifted a single-page report from the stack before her and laid it flat on the table. She didn't need theatrics. The facts were incendiary on their own. This, she said calmly, tapping the document, is a longitudinal study compiled by the National Center for Education Statistics in partnership with the Urban Policy Research Institute, two of the most respected, nonpartisan bodies in this field. She looked up, her eyes hard. It tracked the outcomes of students who received vouchers and enrolled in private institutions over a 5-year period. Her voice dropped slightly, not for dramatic effect, but because what came next didn't need to be shouted. 85% of those students, 85, did not remain in those private schools beyond the second year. She let the number sit, no spin, no interpretation, just the raw devastation of truth. She stepped forward, the paper still in her hand. But now she wasn't just speaking as a lawmaker. She was speaking as someone who had seen this unfold in real time, on real streets, in real families. And the reasons weren't mysterious. They weren't random. They were painfully predictable. Her voice hardened, syllables sharp. The tuition went up. The academic support never arrived. And the moment a child fell behind, struggled with a disability, showed signs of trauma, needed extra help, they were told, "This isn't the right fit." Jasmine's eyes narrowed. Fit? That's the word they use when they're done pretending. She took a breath, steady but low. And if the child happened to be Black or Latino or spoke English as a second language, that fit was questioned faster. Less patient guidance, less grace, more doors quietly closed. Her voice, though controlled, carried the burn of a deep injustice. These schools have the legal right to dismiss any student they deem too difficult, too poor, too different. And they do, without accountability, without transparency, without even having to explain themselves to the public that funded them. She raised the page slightly again, as if daring someone to dispute it. So when we talk about 85% failing to stay, it's not failure, it's filtering. Systematic, targeted, and deliberate. They weren't meant to stay. They were only meant to be counted until they became inconvenient. The data had landed like a hammer, but Jasmine Crockett knew numbers alone could be dismissed, spun, or buried in paperwork. What couldn't be ignored was a human face. She turned slowly to the audience gallery, her voice dipping into a lower, more solemn register. Sometimes the statistics speak, but today someone else will. She extended a hand toward a woman rising quietly from the third row. "This is Ayanna Fields," Jasmine said. "A mother, a voter, a woman who believed in the promise this chamber sold her." Ayanna moved to the microphone slowly, every step heavy with memory. Her black blazer was pressed but worn at the cuffs. In one hand, she held a crumpled sheet of paper, a rejection letter. In the other, a small photo of her son in a bright red hoodie, eyes wide with joy. But Ayanna's voice didn't carry that same joy. It came out thin at first, then steadied with purpose. "They told me this voucher would open doors," she said, "that my son would have a chance, that we finally had options." She paused, lips pressed together. "But 5 schools said no, not because of grades, not because we missed a deadline. They said he didn't meet their behavioral profile. He was 8. His crime was being curious, asking too many questions, struggling to sit still after his dad died." Her hands shook as she unfolded the rejection letter and held it up for the panel to see. "They never said it was about race, or trauma, or the fact that I work 2 jobs and can't volunteer on campus. But it was." She swallowed hard. His old public school, Jefferson Elementary, was shuttered the same year. They said funding had to be redirected. "The building is now a storage facility. My son's classroom is gone." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "Now he rides 2 buses, 90 minutes each way, to a temporary learning center in a rented strip mall next to a pawn shop. There are no teachers with credentials, no counselor, no library, just folding chairs and worksheets." She looked up directly at the senators seated before her. Her words hit harder than any statistic Jasmine could have cited. "I was told I had freedom. What I got was a locked door with a smile on it." Then finally her voice broke. "And my son, he thinks it's his fault, that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong." The room was silent. No shuffle, no whisper. Only the image of an 8-year-old boy smiling from a photo and a mother holding on to him with nothing left but truth. The weight of Ayanna Fields' story still hung heavy in the chamber, a wound left open. Jasmine Crockett didn't try to soften the moment. She turned it into fuel. Her posture shifted, voice tightening into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. She stepped toward the touchscreen on the panel, tapped once, and the monitors behind her flared to life. The heading read in stark, all-caps font, "Internal Investigative Records, New Liberty Ed Foundation." "This," she said slowly, her tone like a courtroom indictment, "is what happens when public funds are handed over to private entities with no real guardrails." She gestured toward the screen. "The New Liberty Ed Foundation has received just over $120 million in taxpayer-funded vouchers in a span of 4 years. $120 million. Meant for students, meant for classrooms." She paused, her gaze scanning the panel. "And how many operational schools does this organization currently maintain?" She let the question settle, then answered it herself. 3. Just 3 schools. Not 30. 3. Her voice cut through the air like a blade through cloth. That's $40 million per school, none of which are accredited and one of which doesn't even meet state safety code. She tapped the screen again. The display shifted, now showing a breakdown of disbursements: $3.2 million in executive bonuses, $4.5 million in consulting contracts with unnamed vendors, $8.9 million in real estate acquisitions for future campus expansion, none of which ever materialize. These aren't investments in education, Jasmine said, her voice steady, bitter with truth. They're cash extractions disguised as reform. Then from a speaker mounted in the ceiling, a pre-recorded voice began to play. It was clinical, dispassionate, unmistakably damning. This is a verified excerpt from the independent forensic audit of the New Liberty Ed Foundation, the voice said. Over 68% of expenditures were categorized as administrative or indirect, with no documentation provided for 5 of the 8 claimed campus sites. Investigators were unable to verify enrollment at 2 locations. One address listed as a school was found to be an abandoned dry cleaner. The room went still, dead still. Jasmine didn't blink. "That's where your child's voucher went," she said quietly. "To a building with no lights, no desks, no teachers, just an empty shell wrapped in tax-funded promises." She looked back at the panel, then slowly around the chamber. "This isn't just waste. It's an engineered betrayal. And the people behind it didn't just take our money, they took our trust, and they used our children's names to do it." The damning audit had barely finished resonating across the chamber. Its final image, an abandoned dry cleaner posing as a school, still etched in the minds of everyone watching. But Senator Ted Cruz, visibly cornered, straightened in his seat and made a calculated pivot. His voice was more restrained now, tinged with frustration, masked as reason. He clasped his hands and leaned in as if guiding the room back to what he considered reality. "What we're witnessing here," Cruz said, carefully measured, "isn't a condemnation of school choice. It's a reflection of weak enforcement, poor management, bureaucratic sloppiness." His words came fast, layered with controlled indignation. "You don't throw out an entire movement because some administrators failed their oversight duties. That's not a policy failure. That's an execution flaw. We don't abandon innovation because the regulators fell asleep. We strengthen the guardrails. We increase transparency. We fix what's broken in implementation, not in principle." He paused, scanning the room like a professor lecturing a stubborn class. "The intent remains noble. The misuse of funds is unacceptable. But that's on the system, not on the solution." He might have continued, but he didn't get the chance. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for him to finish adjusting the narrative. She leaned forward slowly, eyes fixed and voice low, but packed with unshakable force. "If you know the system is weak, Senator, then why keep feeding it?" The room snapped to stillness. There was no echo, no delay, just the heavy silence of impact. Her gaze didn't waver. "You just told us, on record, that the infrastructure is broken, that enforcement is flawed, that oversight is failing, and yet you want to keep channeling hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars through it?" She let the moment hang like a verdict. "You wouldn't pour water into a cracked pipe and act surprised when the floor floods. So why," she asked, voice cutting clean through his defense, "do you keep doing it with our children's futures?" The gravity of her last question had not yet lifted from the chamber. "Why do you keep doing it with our children's futures?" When Jasmine Crockett shifted again, no longer dissecting policy failure, but unmasking its moral foundation. Her tone darkened, her cadence slowed. Every word now carried the weight of indictment, not debate. "This isn't about education anymore," she said quietly, but with the chilling force of someone delivering a verdict. "This is educational capitalism, weaponized." Her eyes swept the room, daring anyone to flinch. "What we've built here isn't a school system, it's a marketplace. And in that marketplace, poor children are not students. They are currency. Their poverty is the pitch. Their struggle is the selling point. And their silence after the door is slammed in their face is the margin these private entities bank on." She gestured toward the earlier slides, still glowing dimly on the screen. Buildings without classrooms, budgets without transparency, schools without students. This isn't about opportunity, it's about volume, scale, return on investment, and no one's regulating the dealers. She took one step forward. Her voice, though still controlled, vibrated with something deeper, an accusation aimed not just at Cruz, but at an entire machine. We're not reforming education. We are commercializing its collapse. We are monetizing its failure and packaging it as freedom. She raised a hand slowly and clenched it into a fist. Not in theater, but in raw emphasis. When your solution depends on the failure of the system you're supposedly trying to fix, you're not a reformer. You're an opportunist. Her eyes locked back onto Cruz. And when billion-dollar hedge funds start opening schools in neighborhoods they wouldn't dare live in, not to serve, but to siphon, that's not education reform. That's exploitation with a tax ID. The air was thick, unmoving. Jasmine finished without theatrics, only truth. This is not a path to justice. This is a business model built on abandonment. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the deeper we sink into complicity. The room was still processing the weight of the previous revelations when Jasmine Crockett took another step forward, her expression hardening. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. What she said next carried the force of facts, of cold, unassailable truth. She clicked the remote again, and the screen behind her flickered to life, showing a dilapidated building in Jacksonville, Florida. The camera zoomed in on a faded sign that had once proudly announced a future, now decayed by neglect. New Horizons Preparatory Academy. It was hard to tell if the cracked, boarded-up windows were more of a metaphor or a warning. Jasmine didn't let the image linger too long, shifting to a financial breakdown, a chart showing the disbursement of over $4.2 million in voucher funds. Here we have New Horizons Preparatory Academy, she began, her voice steady, with no trace of emotion. A school that received over $4 million in public voucher money, taxpayer money. This school was funded to provide a quality education, a lifeline to children who had none. She paused, letting the weight of that statement hang in the air. But this school, this so-called opportunity, was a farce, a fraud. The next slide appeared on the screen. A report clearly marked State Oversight Review, New Horizons Academy. 6 months, Jasmine continued, her voice gaining strength. Just 6 months after receiving taxpayer funds, this school shut its doors. No notice, no explanation, no accountability, just empty classrooms. Her gaze never wavered as she moved closer to the screen, bringing the damning documents into sharper focus. And let me tell you what those 6 months looked like. According to this report, students were crammed into rooms without proper desks, without textbooks, without a teacher with the proper certification. She shook her head, disbelief mixing with anger. They weren't being taught. They were being abandoned, forced to watch videos, unvetted, unapproved, and completely unrelated to their curriculums. No structure, no support, just an empty building pretending to be a school. The room had gone unnervingly quiet, every eye fixed on her, every ear waiting for the next strike. Now, she continued, her voice dropping into a more pointed, sharper tone, let's talk about the people who enabled this. The people who signed off on this disaster, who made the decision to funnel millions of taxpayer dollars into this so-called educational model without ensuring that the money was actually going to serve the children it was supposed to help. Jasmine turned, her eyes locking onto Cruz, each word she spoke cutting through the air with precision. Who voted for this, Senator Cruz? The question hung in the air like a challenge, a dare. Cruz stiffened slightly in his chair, but he didn't flinch. He knew the question was coming, but Jasmine wasn't done yet. She tapped the remote again, and a new slide appeared. This one showed a list of names, each a part of the legislative body that had approved the funding for New Horizons Academy. Each name marked in bold. Names of people who had looked at the financial proposals, read the charter, and still gave their blessing to a school that couldn't even meet the most basic of standards. Here are the people who gave the green light to this travesty, Jasmine said, her voice full of quiet fury. These are the people who decided it was okay to send public funds to a failing organization and call it a success. These are the people who signed off on a lie, who turned a blind eye to the children suffering in the wake of their decisions. She turned back to Cruz. You want to talk about school choice? She said, the words like daggers. This is not choice. This is exploitation. This is about lining pockets and passing off failure as freedom. Jasmine's hand swept over the slide, indicating the names of lawmakers who had signed off on this school's funding. These are the same people who act like vouchers are a silver bullet without realizing they've handed out the keys to the kingdom to people who are only interested in how much money they can make, not how many children they can help. Jasmine stepped back, letting the information wash over the room. She let the faces of the culprits linger on the screen for just a moment too long. The weight of the names, the sheer audacity of the system that allowed this to happen, sank in like a heavy stone in the pit of every stomach present. "Do you know who paid the price for this?" she asked, her voice quiet now, almost too soft. "The children? The families who were promised a better education, a better chance at life. The kids who thought they were getting a shot at something better, only to find themselves locked in a system that wasn't designed to help them. A system that uses their struggles to make a profit." She paused for effect, letting every word land with the weight it deserved. Those children didn't get freedom. They got exploitation in the name of choice. Her voice hardened again as she turned toward Cruz, her gaze unflinching. "And you, Senator Cruz, you stand here, defending a system that allows this. You defend a system that puts dollars over children, that puts politics before education. And you don't even seem to care." She stood tall, resolute. "I'm asking you, who signed off on this, Senator Cruz? Who let this happen? Because this isn't just bad policy. This is criminal neglect. This is the kind of thing that breaks trust in the entire system. And those children, they'll never get their education back. They'll never get the time back." She stood there for a moment, staring down at Cruz, her voice carrying the full weight of the injustice laid bare before everyone. The room was utterly still, all eyes fixed on Jasmine, waiting for her next move. But for a moment, it wasn't about what she would say next. It was about the question she had asked, and the impossible weight of the truth she had just revealed. The room was still heavy with the weight of the evidence she had just laid out. Jasmine Crockett had torn the veil off a system that sold false promises and broken dreams, and now there was nothing left to do but call the question. She didn't rush. She took her time, her eyes moving slowly across the room, ensuring that everyone who needed to hear her words would feel their weight. She glanced toward Cruz, who was still sitting with his hands folded, a mask of forced composure on his face. But she knew he could feel it, feel the pressure. She knew, too, that the room felt it. The quiet, the stillness, the moment before something would shift. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, she turned toward the cameras, her gaze never wavering from the lens. The lights above her flickered slightly, casting a soft glow on her face. The audience, as if instinctively knowing what was coming, held their breath. Her voice, when it came, was as steady as ever. No shout, no outburst, but every word wrapped in truth so sharp it could cut through steel. "If your policies are truly about the children, Senator Cruz," she began, her eyes never leaving the camera, "then why is it that the vast majority of those children are left in silence, unable to speak for themselves? Their schools shut down, their futures stolen. And yet, not one of you here has spoken up?" The question wasn't just directed at Cruz. It was directed at everyone in that room, at every lawmaker who had stood by and let this happen. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the unspoken truth of what had been revealed. Then slowly the sound came, a soft clap at first, tentative, almost as if the audience wasn't sure whether it was allowed to break the tension. But it didn't take long before the applause grew louder, filling the room with its thunderous weight. It was a wave, a force of collective recognition and moral clarity. It wasn't just for Jasmine's words, it was for the children who had been left behind. It was for the families who had been betrayed. The applause swelled, louder and more insistent, until the room was reverberating with it, the walls almost shaking. Jasmine stood there still, letting it wash over her. She didn't need the applause, but she knew what it meant. She knew it wasn't for her. It was for the children who had no voice, the parents who had no power, and the system that had taken everything from them and then tried to justify it as choice. She turned back toward Cruz, her eyes narrowing just slightly, but her expression was unchanged, calm, composed, unyielding. He had heard the question, he had heard the truth, and now he had no place to hide. For the first time, Cruz's facade faltered. His fingers twitched, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough to show the crack in his armor. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, darted away from Jasmine's gaze. He cleared his throat, trying to reassert control over the moment, but it was too late. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room had already turned its attention back to Jasmine, and Cruz knew deep down that the tide had shifted. He was no longer in control of the narrative. The applause, though not for him, had buried him in its wake. He was left to sit, to stew in the truth that had just been laid bare. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She had already asked the question that mattered. She had already forced the truth into the light. There was nothing left for Cruz to say that could undo the damage. And in that moment, it wasn't about Cruz. It wasn't about the politics. It wasn't about the debate or the headlines. It was about the children who would never get back their lost years. It was about the families who had been sold a lie. And most of all, it was about the undeniable weight of justice, sitting squarely on Jasmine Crockett's shoulders, staring Cruz and everyone else down. The room held its breath one last time, and then slowly, Jasmine turned away, her task complete. The room buzzed with the tension of unanswered questions, the weight of every word Jasmine Crockett had spoken pressing down on the chamber. The applause had faded, but the echoes of it still reverberated in the minds of everyone present. Cruz, still silent, shifted in his seat, his face tight, his mind racing for a defense. But Jasmine was no longer speaking to him. She wasn't even speaking to the panel anymore. She was speaking to the future, speaking to the people whose lives hung in the balance of the policies they voted on today. She stepped forward again, this time with purpose. Her voice rang out, steady and unwavering. "Let me make something perfectly clear," she said, pausing, her eyes sweeping over the room. "I'm not here to attack religion. I'm here to attack the people who use religion as a mask, as a tool to siphon public funds for their own profit." Her words cut through the air with the precision of a blade, aimed directly at the heart of the hypocrisy she had just exposed. It's not about faith, it's about greed. It's about individuals who have found a way to exploit a system that's supposed to help children, not enrich their pockets. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, her gaze locked onto Cruz, daring him to deny the truth. It's not about schools. It's not about the children's futures. It's about taking money that should go to public education. Money meant to educate every child, regardless of their background, and putting it into the hands of private investors who have no interest in these children's success, only in the size of their returns. She didn't flinch as her words hung heavy in the air, challenging anyone who might still try to defend the system. She was deconstructing piece by piece. "And I'll tell you this right now," she continued, voice rising with a quiet, measured intensity. "I'm not going to sit by while this goes on any longer. I'm not going to let this travesty continue to strip away the very foundation of our public education system. I won't be silent, and neither should any of you." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. "I will introduce, immediately after this hearing, the Public School Protection Act, a bill designed to safeguard our schools from this predatory system. A bill that will ensure every dollar of public funding goes to public schools that serve all students, not just those who can afford to pay for privilege. It will hold those accountable who are using the system to profit off our children's futures." She didn't look away. The camera zoomed in on her face, and for a moment everything else in the room faded into the background. Jasmine wasn't just standing before them. She was standing for something much larger, something much more powerful than any political game. This bill will make sure that our public schools are protected from those who seek to turn education into a commodity. It will hold accountable anyone who seeks to profit from our children's futures. And it will protect the one system that is supposed to serve all of us equally. Her voice grew sharper, each syllable deliberate and cutting through the room like a final command. "You want to stand for the children? Stand for the ones who have no choice? Stand for the ones who have no voice in this system? Stand for the ones whose futures are being stolen from them under the guise of freedom of choice?" She took a slow, deliberate breath, then added, "This isn't freedom, Senator Cruz. It's exploitation dressed up in the language of opportunity." She glanced back at the screen one last time. where the images of the neglected schools, New Horizons Preparatory Academy, still loom large like ghosts of promises broken. We are not giving these children a choice. We are giving them a system that fails them. We are giving them an illusion of opportunity, but no real future. Her voice softened slightly, but the impact remained the same. This ends now. It ends with us. She turned back to Cruz, who had been quietly watching her, his face flushed, his hands now tense in his lap. So, I'll ask again, who stands with the children? Who stands with the communities that have been left behind? Because I know where I stand. I'm standing for every single student who has been left to suffer while you've sold them a dream of a system that's nothing but a mirage. As Jasmine spoke, the camera zoomed out, capturing not just her, but the faces of those in the room, some nodding, some looking away. The decision had been made, not by Cruz, not by the panel, but by her, by every mother, every child, every teacher, and every neglected school she represented. She wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The air in the room was thick, almost electric. It wasn't just a speech, it was a moment. And for the first time that day, the fight wasn't just political, it was personal. Every word she had spoken had taken aim at the very core of an unjust system, and now it was clear. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going anywhere. Jasmine Crockett stepped away from the microphone, the tension of the moment still hanging heavy in the air. But as she moved, her eyes never left Cruz, nor did the eyes of the audience. They knew she had made her stand, and now there was no turning back. As the final words of Jasmine Crockett's speech hung in the air, a silence fell over the chamber. The tension was palpable, but the battle had already shifted, away from Cruz, away from the bureaucratic talk, away from the policies that sought to deceive the public. Now the stakes were clearer than ever. The focus was no longer on the convoluted rhetoric, but on the lives being directly impacted by the system Cruz had so ardently defended. Without a word, Jasmine clicked the remote again, and the screens behind her flickered to life. This time, it wasn't a diagram of financial malfeasance or political maneuvering. It was a classroom, a dilapidated room lit by flickering fluorescent lights that did little to brighten the dust-covered windows. The walls were scarred, cracked, and peeling. The desks, mismatched and worn, sat in rows like forgotten soldiers, each seat carrying the weight of dreams unfulfilled. But it wasn't the room that struck hardest. It was the children. The camera panned slowly over a row of students, their hands raised high, faces full of hope, but haunted by a deeper understanding of the reality they lived in. Their uniforms were faded, their notebooks barely held together by fraying edges. One child, barely 12, clutched a pencil so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, but he never stopped reaching for the sky, hoping his hand would be the one chosen. Next to him, a girl raised her hand with a determined look, her uniform crumpled and her shoes worn, but she was undeterred. Each face in that room, despite the weariness of the world they faced, still clung to that small hope. The hope that they mattered, that their futures mattered. The camera lingered on the children for a moment, showing their yearning, their unspoken understanding that their education was a game of survival, not opportunity. The room was still, yet in their eyes there was a quiet revolution, an unvoiced cry that no one in power was hearing. And then, in bold, stark letters across the screen, a question appeared. Who is truly being educated and who is being sacrificed? The question burned into the minds of everyone watching, a question that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of it all hung in the air like the thickest fog, clouding every rational explanation, every politician's defense. It was a simple truth, one so sharp it couldn't be twisted into anything else. Jasmine's voice echoed in the background, not as a direct address to the chamber, but as a lingering truth that refused to fade. The children in this room will never be given the resources they deserve, she said, her words slow and deliberate. But they still raise their hands. They still reach for the stars, even though the very system that should be lifting them up has abandoned them. The camera focused on the children's faces as they looked up, not knowing if their hand would be chosen, but still believing it might be, still believing they had a shot. But Jasmine knew the truth they weren't yet ready to understand. The system wasn't going to choose them, not the way it should. The system wasn't meant to raise them up. It was designed to keep them down, to prioritize profit over potential. And the children in that room, those innocent hands raised in the hope of a better future, were the price they were all paying. The screen flickered again, this time showing a wide shot of the classroom, empty except for those hands still raised. They were the last remnants of hope in a place that had given up on them long ago. The camera zoomed out, but the haunting image of their outstretched hands stayed with you. Those hands reached for a future that was never meant to be theirs. The weight of Jasmine's words was undeniable, and the room felt suffocating in its stillness. The children, the future of the nation, had been abandoned by a system that called itself a savior while quietly stripping them of every chance. Every child raised their hand, hoping for a future that was slipping farther and farther away, all the while knowing that in the end, they were the ones paying the price for the choices made by people who would never know their names. The shot faded slowly, but not before the words across the screen became etched in everyone's minds. Who is truly being educated, and who is being sacrificed? And as the screen went dark, the question didn't fade. It lingered in the air like smoke from a fire no one was willing to extinguish. The room remained heavy, still vibrating with the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's call to action. But the questions she posed, the questions that had hung in the air, were not ones that could be easily answered with simple policy or rhetoric. This wasn't just about laws. It was about something deeper. It was about lives, real, fragile, struggling lives that were caught in the crossfire of systems designed to profit from their pain. And as the chamber settled, the spotlight shifted, not to the political combatants, but to the undeniable reality of what had been revealed. Jasmine knew this wasn't just another fight in a long list of political battles. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about something that transcended every speech, every argument, every vote. This was about the human cost, the children whose futures were gambled away before they even had a chance to dream. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle in her chest, but she knew she couldn't leave it there. Not now, not after everything she had seen. "This is the price of inequality," she said, her voice now softer, but firm, like the last ember of a dying fire. Her eyes swept the room once more, not with anger, but with something far more powerful: resolve. The price of turning our backs on the ones who need us the most. There was no need to name names anymore. The evidence was already clear. The disparity in the room between the children whose lives hung in the balance and the system that refused to protect them was staggering. Jasmine's words were not just a call for justice, but a summons to the conscience of everyone who had a hand in perpetuating the brokenness of a system designed to abandon its most vulnerable. "When we allow this to continue," she continued, her voice steady, yet carrying an unspoken weight, "we are allowing the theft of hope. We are selling out our future to the highest bidder. And we are teaching our children that the value of their lives is measured not in the promise of an education, but in the weight of their parents' pockets." The room could feel it, the magnitude of the question hanging in the air, asking them all to look at the lives they had been ignoring for so long. The choice wasn't whether they could fix the system. It was whether they had the courage to recognize the injustice that had already taken root. Jasmine paused for just a heartbeat, allowing the gravity of her statement to sink in. Then, in a voice that broke through the silence like a trumpet's call, she continued, "This is not just a policy issue. This is a human issue. This is about us, about who we are and what we stand for. And it is about how far we are willing to let things go before we say enough is enough." She took a step back, her words ringing in the chamber as if they were the conclusion to a long-fought battle. "We can't pretend this system is about choice, because it's not. It's about who gets to decide which children have a future and which children are left behind." She paused again, the room holding its breath, not just because of her words, but because of what they meant. For too long, too many people had turned a blind eye to the suffering of those who didn't have the privilege to fight for themselves. For too long, the system had been designed to protect the few at the expense of the many. And as Jasmine stood there, she wasn't just talking to Cruz. She was talking to every person in that room, to every person who had the power to change the course of a generation. "We can no longer be passive," she said, the challenge now clear in her voice, the final call to arms. "We must demand that our future, the future of our children, be built on something better than the bones of broken promises. We must demand that education become a right, not a privilege. That every child, regardless of their background, deserves the opportunity to rise, to learn, to grow." Her words echoed throughout the room, their resonance undeniable. If we believe in fairness, in equality, in justice, we must act. If we believe that every child deserves the same chance at success, we must make that belief our reality. As she finished speaking, the gravity of her words settled on everyone present, and for a long moment it was as though time itself had come to a halt. The silence wasn't just a pause, it was the deep, collective acknowledgement of the brokenness that existed. The silence was the space where every person in that room was confronted with the truth that had been laid bare by Jasmine's words. The choices they made in the next moments would not only define their political legacies, but would determine the lives of those children whose futures were on the line. "This is not a political game," Jasmine continued, her voice softer now, yet no less commanding. "This is a fight for the soul of our nation. This is a fight for what we stand for. And I will not be quiet until those children have the future they deserve." Her words left a ringing silence in the chamber. The faces of the people in the room were hard to read, but the weight of her resolve was unmistakable. The injustices she had exposed couldn't be ignored anymore. They were standing in the light, unprotected by the walls of bureaucracy and indifference that had hidden them for so long. She stepped back, looking directly at Cruz, then at the others who had been complicit in the system. She didn't need to say another word. Her stance, her unwavering conviction, her willingness to speak the truth. It was enough. The camera panned back over the empty classrooms, over the abandoned schools that were meant to uplift but had been gutted by greed and neglect. The children's hands, still raised in silent defiance, had been the ones left behind, the ones whose futures had been bartered away. And Jasmine, standing at the forefront of this fight, wasn't just asking for change, she was demanding it. It's time we asked ourselves, what is the future worth? And who will we be when it's gone? The tension in the room still crackled, like the final moments of a storm. The truth Jasmine Crockett had just exposed hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. The echoes of the damning revelations hadn't yet faded, but Jasmine didn't let the moment linger too long. She had more to say. This wasn't about just winning an argument. This was about something bigger. It was about an entire system that had failed the very people it was supposed to protect. The children, the families, the future of the country. She stood still for a moment, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Her eyes swept across the room, making contact with the faces of the lawmakers, some still in shock, others looking away, unable to meet her gaze. Then she spoke, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of everything that had come before. "I'm not here to attack religion," she said, her voice clear and calm, though it carried a deep and quiet conviction. "I'm here to attack the people who use religion as a shield, who hide behind faith to siphon public funds for their own enrichment." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to refute her. She didn't pause. "This isn't about faith, it's about greed. It's about exploiting a system designed to help the most vulnerable and turning it into a profit-driven machine that leaves children behind." Her voice rose now, every word deliberate, every syllable punctuating the injustice. "We are not reforming education. We are commodifying failure. We are taking public dollars meant for public schools, meant for all children, and funneling them into a private sector that isn't accountable to anyone. This is not about choice. This is about creating a two-tier system where the wealthy get everything and the poor are left to fight for scraps." The room seemed to draw a collective breath as her words cut through the air, relentless and raw. But Jasmine wasn't done. She stepped forward, every movement sharp and purposeful. "And I won't stand by while people profit from our children's futures. I won't stand by while we allow private interests to take what should be the public's right. I won't stand by while we abandon those most in need and call it freedom." She paused then, her eyes locking with Cruz, who had remained silent, but who now seemed to shrink under her gaze. The chamber was still. Her next words came slowly, measured but with the power of truth behind them. I will introduce, immediately following this hearing, the Public School Protection Act, a bill that will ensure that every dollar of public funding goes to public schools that serve all students, and not to private institutions that treat children as commodities to be bought and sold. Her voice softened, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind it. This bill will protect the schools that need it most, the schools that welcome every child regardless of their race, their income, their background. And it will hold accountable those who have exploited this system for their own gain. It will ensure that no child is left behind because someone else chose to make a profit off of their future. Jasmine stood there for a moment, looking at the faces around her, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. The fight wasn't just about politics. It was about the soul of the nation, about whether it would continue to abandon its most vulnerable for the sake of convenience and profit. And Jasmine Crockett, in that moment, wasn't just a politician. She was the voice for those who had been silenced, the advocate for those who had been left behind. "This is the fight we must have," she said, voice ringing with conviction. "Because our children deserve better. They deserve a future built on education, not exploitation. And I will keep fighting until that future is a reality." The silence that followed was not one of hesitation, but one of recognition. The question had been asked. The challenge had been laid down. And now it was up to those in the room, those with the power to change, to make the decision. Would they stand for justice? Or would they continue to let a broken system sacrifice the future of their children? And for Jasmine, there was no turning back. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a congressional hearing broadcast to over 42 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stares down Elon Musk, the tech titan accused of building his green empire on the broken backs of underpaid workers and poisoned neighborhoods. As Musk defends his empire with bold claims and dismissive smirks, Crockett strikes back with chilling reports of environmental destruction and rising illness near his factories. The hearing spirals into chaos, reputations tremble, and one explosive exchange changes everything. When power meets truth in the nation's highest chamber, who will the people believe? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors to the congressional hearing room thundered open as Jasmine Crockett stepped through in a sharply tailored black suit, her heels clicking like a war drum on the polished marble floor. She wasn't just walking into a room, she was entering a battlefield, representing thousands of families whose children wheezed through poisoned air and whose wells now ran with metallic tang. Jasmine carried more than papers. She carried testimony carved in suffering. Her eyes were steel, jaw set, every step pulsing with righteous defiance. These were not theoretical debates for her. These were mothers bearing children, workers coughing blood, schools evacuated due to chemical burns in the soil. As she took her seat, her gaze locked forward, toward the man who, in her mind, symbolized the cold detachment of unchecked power. Elon Musk sat reclined, smirking, as if the lives crushed beneath his empire were acceptable collateral in the name of innovation. Cameras rolled. The air was tight, heavy, and electric. In that moment, it wasn't just a hearing, it was Judgment Day. Across the room, Elon Musk adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back like a king forced to humor a peasant rebellion. He wasn't intimidated, he was annoyed. To him, this was political theater, a stage where uninformed populace took aim at progress they didn't understand. SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink. He saw them as humanity's salvation. So what if a few towns suffered some unintended consequences? Musk viewed Jasmine not as a legislator, but as a loud voice clinging to outdated notions of fairness. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, the condescension rolling off him like static. He didn't see her fire, only noise. But Jasmine knew what he didn't. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to expose. And no amount of money, Mars missions, or smirking disdain could save him from what she had brought to the table. As the gavel slammed, the war began, not with shouts, but with a silence so loaded it nearly cracked the walls. But Crockett wasn't there for theater. She was there to peel back the polished veneer of innovation and reveal the rot beneath. And when she began, she did not raise her voice. She let the facts do the screaming. She called up a series of satellite images on the main monitor. The first was from 5 years ago. Nevada's Clayton Valley, serene, its salt flats shimmering like silver under a desert sun. The next showed its present state, scarred, hollowed, bleeding. Massive lithium extraction fields stretched for miles, machines slicing into the crust of the earth like surgical knives turned reckless. This, Jasmine said, voice low but taut as wire, is the cost of Elon Musk's battery dreams. She moved swiftly. Argentina's Salinas Grandes, once a sacred salt plain, now a pale wasteland leaching arsenic into groundwater. Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, a marvel of nature, now fractured by pump lines and containment pools where flamingos no longer fly. These weren't isolated industrial zones. These were living ecosystems Musk's empire had treated like parts warehouses. Each map flickering behind her was another indictment. Then came the air no one could breathe. In Fremont, California, the air around Tesla's flagship Gigafactory tested positive for particulate matter levels well above EPA limits. Musk promised zero emissions, Jasmine snapped, but he forgot to mention the communities choking on the price of that promise. The next slide, zip codes near Giga Texas, where airborne VOCs, volatile organic compounds, had spiked since SpaceX expanded its launch testing. Crockett read the lab results aloud. Benzene, toluene, formaldehyde, all carcinogens. Then she paused, eyes steady. This isn't progress. This is chemical warfare by spreadsheet. She stepped forward and switched to human cost. A school nurse's logbook from Hidalgo County was entered into the record. 12 children hospitalized in a single month for unexplained nosebleeds and dizziness. Another file detailed rising asthma diagnoses in Cameron Parish, Louisiana, near a lithium processing site backed by a Musk affiliate. One small girl, Amaya Rivera, age 9, had collapsed during recess. Her father's testimony followed, voice shaking as he wrote, "No one told us the new facility would poison the wind." The hearing room fell silent. No rebuttal, just the cold, ticking metronome of accountability. But Jasmine wasn't finished. These people, she said, don't get NDAS. They don't get press teams. They don't have the luxury of calling destruction disruption. They get nosebleeds, birth defects, cancer. Her tone had shifted, not rage, not even despair, but something sharper, clarity laced with sorrow. Your future, Mr. Musk, she said coldly, is being built on lungs that never consented. And just like that, the myth cracked. And if the poisoned land wasn't enough, Jasmine turned to the part of the story that couldn't be paved over or spun with press releases. What it had done to human flesh, to lungs and bloodstreams, and tiny hearts that had no voice in this industrial conquest. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Instead, she placed a thick folder onto the table with both hands, slowly, deliberately, then flipped it open to the first page. The screen behind her lit up with a heat map glowing red. This, she said evenly, is not opinion. It is not activism. It is medical data, compiled over 7 years, reviewed by physicians, dismissed by investors. The map showed communities adjacent to Tesla's gigafactories, to SpaceX's launch pads, to lithium processing plants in California, Nevada, Texas. In every pocket of industry Musk had touched, another dark bloom had spread: elevated cancer clusters, aggressive respiratory illness, birth abnormalities. Jasmine zoomed in on Fremont, California. This community, she said, tapping the screen, has seen a 31% rise in adult-onset leukemia within a 5-mile radius of your plant since 2018. That's not a glitch. That's a body count. She changed slides. Boca Chica, Texas. Pediatric asthma cases up 240%. 8-year-olds using inhalers during recess. 4-year-olds hospitalized with collapsed lungs. Jasmine read a hospital record aloud. Child experienced acute respiratory failure after prolonged exposure to outdoor air on high-test days. There was no factory warning, no community notification, just burning throats and ER bills. She turned the page. Sparks, Nevada, a spike in glioblastoma cases among plant workers. Men in their 40s, diagnosed within months of each other. We traced it, she said, holding up another document. The exposure came from unshielded heavy metal dust drifting beyond factory walls. No filters, no barriers, just wind. Her voice lowered. And profit. Then came the letter. It wasn't typed. It wasn't bound. Just 3 pages of trembling handwriting, penned by a widow whose husband had spent 5 years working a Tesla floor and 3 months dying in a hospital bed. Jasmine read it slowly. They told him he was lucky to have the job. They never told us what was in the air. The final line, I buried the father of my children last April. Your machines still run. Jasmine folded the letter and placed it face up before Elon Musk like a silent accusation. Her hand didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. Your innovation, she said, is measured in profit per share. Ours is measured in funerals per zip code. And for the first time that morning, the air in the chamber felt heavier than numbers, like grief had finally entered the room and taken a seat beside them all. And as the weight of testimony hung in the air, like a storm refusing to break, Elon Musk finally moved. Not with guilt, not with humility, but with the cool, mechanical precision of someone who believed he was still the smartest man in the room. He clasped his hands, tilted his chin ever so slightly, and began speaking not to the people but above them, as if the chamber were too small for the size of his vision. Let's recalibrate the narrative, he said, voice smooth as brushed steel, utterly devoid of apology. What we are building at Tesla, at SpaceX, across every venture I lead, is not destruction, it's salvation. He nodded toward the images of collapsed lungs and poisoned rivers, still flickering faintly on the congressional monitors. I don't deny there are impacts, but innovation isn't sterile, it never has been. The first railroads displaced thousands, the first power plants blackened skies. But what came after? Modernity, civilization. His eyes scanned the room, not to connect, but to assert. Electric vehicles reduce emissions. Solar roofs eliminate coal dependence. Reusable rockets will one day allow us to offload industrial processes to space, away from Earth entirely. These aren't hypotheticals, they're happening. And I won't apologize because progress made someone uncomfortable along the way. Then, as if to twist the blade into the raw nerve Jasmine had laid bare, he added with a faint smirk, frankly, most of these so-called harms are growing pains amplified by fear-mongering. The silence in the room shifted, not stunned, but seething. But Musk didn't notice. He leaned back, perfectly composed, his voice softer now, but laced with something colder. You see loss. I see trajectory. And in that moment, it wasn't just denial, it was doctrine. A worldview where graphs outweighed gravestones and futures justified everything scorched in their wake. But just when the chamber thought Elon Musk had finished defending his empire, he pivoted, calmly, deliberately, and let the contempt bleed through. His face didn't contort. It didn't need to. The precision of his insult came not in volume, but in design, like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He turned toward Jasmine Crockett, locking eyes as if she were the only person in the room who still didn't get it. You don't understand technology, he said, each word clipped and sharp. You never have. People like you, legislators with law degrees and microphones, you're quick to judge, slow to grasp. His voice was low but carried, each syllable slicing through the quiet like a whisper in a cathedral. You speak in problem, he continued, while we, builders, thinkers, engineers, we deal in solutions. You don't code. You don't invent. You hold up charts of suffering and call it strategy, but you've never risked anything to make the world better. He leaned back in his chair slightly, satisfied, as if he'd just checked a queen with a pawn. You look at a factory and see pollution. I look at it and see the future of civilization. You obsess over symptoms. I'm curing the disease. A beat passed. Intentional. Suffocating. Then came the final strike. You can't see the big picture, Congresswoman, he said, voice dripping with authority, because you've never stood high enough to look. Around the room, jaws clenched. Staffers shifted. Cameras zoomed. But Musk didn't flinch. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was clarification. A reminder to everyone watching that power, when dressed in certainty and cashmere confidence, could humiliate without ever raising its voice. And Jasmine, still silent, sat motionless, until the silence itself began to bend around her like pressure before a storm. And Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Because while Musk wielded wealth and ego like armor, she came armed with something far more dangerous: facts soaked in blood, inked in breathless diagnoses, and stitched into the lungs of forgotten people. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for the second binder, thicker than the first, its corners curled with use, its spine creased from nights poured over under hospital lights and kitchen tables. She placed it gently on the desk like a silent coffin and opened it with the care of someone who knew exactly what was buried inside. Since Mr. Musk suggests I don't understand, she said evenly, let's hear from those who do. The first slide that lit up behind her bore the stamp of the CDC, a 5-year longitudinal study mapping respiratory illnesses across 3 zip codes bordering the Gigafactory in Sparks, Nevada. The data was unforgiving. In that time frame, asthma rates among children had more than doubled. ER visits for lung inflammation had tripled. Jasmine pointed to the graph. This, she said coldly, isn't fear. It's inflammation under a microscope. She turned the page. A peer-reviewed journal article from The Lancet detailing clusters of glioblastoma, rare aggressive brain tumors, emerging among workers at a lithium refining facility contracted by one of Musk's holding companies. These aren't aging miners, she said. They're engineers, line technicians, fathers in their 30s. She cited pathology reports from University of Texas Health, confirming high concentrations of cobalt and arsenic in blood samples from nearby residents. Then came the voices, transcripts from doctors on the ground. One pulmonologist wrote, I've never seen this many collapsed lungs in non-smokers under 40. Another, an oncologist from El Paso, noted a pattern of rare cancers appearing with geographic consistency near extraction sites. Jasmine didn't embellish. She didn't need to. This is not a correlation, she said. This is a pattern. This is a signature. And that signature has Elon Musk's name all over it. She looked up, not at Musk, but at the chamber itself, daring them to ignore what was now seared into the record. This isn't progress, she said, her voice low, steady, final. It's a slow-motion collapse of public health, delivered beneath the noise of launch engines and the branding of brilliance. But as Jasmine's voice fell silent, her final line hanging in the air like a blade yet to drop, Elon Musk leaned forward with surgical intent, not to defend, but to diminish. He folded his hands, elbows propped neatly on the polished table, and delivered his words with the clipped precision of someone who believed intellect granted him immunity from consequence. This, he said slowly, gesturing to the wall of evidence behind her, is the danger of letting ideology masquerade as expertise. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The arrogance was baked into every syllable. You stand here waving around charts and quoting studies you didn't write about systems you don't understand. But the truth, Congresswoman, is that you don't speak the language of technology. You speak politics. You speak fear. He turned slightly, facing the panel, but never breaking eye contact with her. You reduce generational breakthroughs to press bait and anecdote. You compare rockets to smokestacks and act shocked when the math outpaces your outrage. Then came the blade. You see a factory and think cancer clusters, he said, voice silk-wrapped steel. I see a global supply chain that moves humanity forward. One of us is looking at a blueprint. The other is shouting at shadows on the wall. The insult landed not just as dismissal, but as erasure, a denial not only of Jasmine's position, but of her capacity to even comprehend the world he believed he ruled. And for a breathless second, the room stopped, caught between the sterile chill of Musk's contempt and the quiet fire building behind the woman he just tried to bury in condescension. But the sting of dismissal didn't break Jasmine. It forged her into something colder, harder, more precise. She stood without hesitation, her posture straight, her hands steady on the edge of the microphone, as though bracing against the weight of centuries behind her. The silence was thick, taut as wire, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It focused, like a scalpel slicing through noise. "Let me be clear," she said, each word carved in steel. "You don't get to dress up exploitation in the language of innovation and expect it to go unchallenged." She leaned in slightly, her tone unwavering, measured, lethal. "Your vision of progress cannot come at the cost of poisoned lungs, buried children, or entire zip codes reduced to sacrifice zones. Human health is not a rounding error in your profit margins. You talk about the future as if it belongs to you, but the people gasping for air in Boca Chica, in Sparks, in Fremont, they're living in the wreckage of your present." She held up a photo, small, crumpled, a child with a nasal cannula, eyes wide with confusion. "He's not a data point. He's not a bump in your supply chain. He is the consequence of a man who thinks acceleration matters more than accountability." Her voice lowered. "So no, I'm not here for show. I'm here because someone has to say what your money tries to drown." Elon Musk didn't pause. He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, like a man bored of being corrected by those he deemed beneath him. His smile was thin, deliberate. "Do you even know what you're talking about?" he asked, his tone laced with casual disdain. "Or are you just doing what politicians always do, flashing outrage to stay relevant?" He tilted his head, mocking curiosity. "Seriously, Congresswoman? Do you actually know the chemical signature of lithium hydroxide? Or are you just here to make headlines?" The words weren't an argument. They were an erasure, designed to shrink her into a soundbite. What he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that her silence after that wasn't retreat. It was restraint. And restraint, in the right hands, was far more dangerous than rage. And as the echo of Musk's contemptuous question still smoldered in the air, "Do you even know what you're talking about?" the balance in the room shifted. Slowly, sharply. It was no longer a duel between Jasmine Crockett and Elon Musk. It was a reckoning. The atmosphere thickened, not just with tension, but with consequence. The committee had watched Musk deflect, belittle, and polish his empire with abstractions. But now one of their own was ready to strike with something Musk hadn't prepared for: direct accountability. Representative Leonard Hartley, a seasoned legislator from Pennsylvania's 7th District, leaned forward with measured calm. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Mr. Musk," he began, speaking slowly so the cameras and stenographers wouldn't miss a single word, "can you provide to this committee any concrete, independently verified data that guarantees the safety of the communities currently living in the shadow of your industrial operations?" He paused. "Specifically, I'm asking whether you or your companies have submitted environmental and public health safety reports, verified by third-party medical or environmental experts, that show no significant adverse health effects linked to your projects." The chamber went still. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was clinical, unforgiving, the kind that demanded not philosophy, but paper. Musk shifted. A flicker, barely perceptible, passed across his face. It was gone in less than a second, but it was real. He leaned into the microphone, but there was hesitation in the movement, as if for the first time he wasn't sure if what he had to say would land. "We, of course, take safety very seriously," he began, voice still even, but lacking its earlier force. "We've conducted internal assessments across multiple facilities, Tesla, SpaceX, and others, looking at emissions controls, containment systems, and exposure thresholds." He glanced down at his notes. A pause. "Our teams are working on sustainability metrics that align with evolving global standards. We're developing frameworks for long-term safety compliance." Hartley didn't blink. "That's not what I asked," he said. "You mentioned internal assessments. That's fine. But have those assessments been reviewed and confirmed by any independent scientific body? Any public health institution? Any environmental watchdog not paid by your companies?" A longer pause. Musk's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the desk. He looked briefly to the right, toward his legal counsel, who offered nothing but a blank stare in the absence of a lifeline. The room was silent except for the soft hum of equipment and the scribbling of journalists. Musk tried again, this time faster but less composed. We've initiated contact with several review boards. Some of those dialogues are ongoing. There are reports in the pipeline, some under peer review, others pending publication. His voice thinned. These things take time. There's a process. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The absence of her voice in that moment made her presence heavier than ever, because the question wasn't even hers, and still, the answer felt like her vindication. Hartley pressed once more. "Let me be even more specific," he said. "Can you, right now, provide this committee with a single published, independently verified health study showing that proximity to your gigafactories, launch sites, or refining operations has not resulted in statistically significant harm to nearby residents?" Musk sat back slightly. The mask had not shattered, but it had cracked. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat, and, finally, admitted what the room already knew. "Not at this time," he said quietly. "But we are working toward transparency." The words dropped like stones into the chamber. Not at this time. In an instant, the posture of the room shifted. Staffers took note. Lawmakers exchanged glances. Jasmine lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but in calm, quiet affirmation. For all the billions Musk had funneled into propulsion and automation, he could not produce a single, clean document that proved he wasn't harming the very people he claimed to uplift. His equations didn't include them. His vision had moved too far ahead to account for those he'd left coughing in the dust behind him. And in that moment, without theatrics or fury, Elon Musk, architect of the future, was exposed as a man unprepared for the moral calculus of the present. And the moment Elon Musk uttered those 5 brittle words, "Not at this time," something shifted in the room, almost imperceptibly at first. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly from her seat, the weight of everything she had witnessed now boiling beneath her ribs. But there was no trembling in her stance, no chaos in her expression, only control, cold, precise, coiled like thunder just before it splits the sky. She approached the mic not like a politician, but like a surgeon preparing the final incision. "Let the record show," she began, her voice firm and deliberate, "that the man with the power to reroute satellites, to tunnel beneath cities, to launch rockets beyond our atmosphere, cannot provide a single document to prove his companies haven't harmed the people who breathe next to his factories." The chamber froze. Even the air conditioning seemed to fall silent, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Jasmine's eyes swept the panel, not for permission, but to deliver a challenge they could no longer look away from. "I am submitting a formal request," she continued, sliding a heavy folder across the table. The cover marked boldly, "Urgent motion for federal environmental and public health oversight. We are calling for a comprehensive, independent investigation into the full public health impact of every industrial site operated or contracted by Mr. Musk companies. I'm talking gigafactories, launch pads, refineries, satellite nodes, lithium mines, every footprint he has left on American soil and beyond." Her hand didn't move from the document. It was as if she were pressing it into the conscience of the room. This is not political theater. This is legislative obligation. This is about lives. She turned, addressing the room, not just her colleagues, but the invisible millions she carried in her voice. "For too long, we've allowed the myth of progress to outshout the screams of the people it tramples. We've let PR departments rewrite the definition of harm. We've let quarterly profits speak louder than rising cancer rates." Her tone intensified, not louder, but heavier. "That ends now. We will no longer let communities near these facilities be treated as disposable testing grounds for industrial ambition. We will not let high-tech pollution be excused as innovation." She reached into the binder and pulled out several sealed envelopes. "These are signed testimonies from pediatricians, emergency room nurses, environmental toxicologists, and grieving parents. I'm asking the Oversight Committee to subpoena Elon Musk's environmental reports, internal health assessments, insurance disclosures, and all communications regarding safety mitigation. If those documents don't exist, that's not an oversight. It's a crime in slow motion. There was a brief pause, and then her voice dropped, not in force, but in intimacy, as if she were suddenly speaking to one person, a mother, a worker, a child watching from a living room where the walls shake every time a rocket fires from a few miles away. I've walked through these towns. I've breathed the ash they breathe. I've seen playgrounds empty by noon because the air becomes unbreathable. I've met a 10-year-old with the lungs of a 70-year-old coal miner, and I will not, under any circumstance, allow those stories to be buried beneath spreadsheets and shareholder slides. She faced Musk once more, not with anger, but with unflinching certainty. "Mr. Musk," she said quietly, "if you want to lead humanity into the future, you're going to have to prove you're not killing it on the way there." Then she turned back to the panel. "And to my colleagues, if we fail to act now, we are complicit. If we let this go unexamined, we send a message to every corporation in America that people are cheaper than silence, that science is negotiable, that wealth can purchase immunity from responsibility. We are not here to regulate ambition. We are here to protect life." There were no cheers, no applause, just silence, thick, cold, and righteous. And in that silence, for the first time all morning, Elon Musk looked like a man not ahead of the moment, but caught inside it. And as Jasmine's final sentence landed, "We are not here to regulate ambition. We are here to protect life," the tension in the hearing room crystallized into something sharper, colder, and unmistakably real. For hours, the weight of testimony had accumulated like storm clouds. Images of sick children, silenced workers, poisoned air, and now lightning struck. The political theater Musk had expected had become something far more dangerous, federal machinery awakening. It was Representative Ellen McCready, moderate Democrat from Colorado, known for her caution and long silences, who spoke first. But this time, there was no hesitation. Her voice cut clean through the static. "Madam Chair," she began, her fingers resting firmly on a thick folder stamped Environmental Subcommittee findings, "I move that this chamber formally initiate a full, independent federal investigation into the environmental and public health consequences of all industrial projects owned, funded, or contracted by Mr. Elon Musk and his affiliated companies." The sentence didn't rise like applause. It dropped like a verdict. The room froze. Even Elon Musk, who had previously leaned back with his signature detachment, now subtly adjusted forward. A shift, small, but undeniable. The chairwoman, sensing the weight of the moment, glanced briefly around the dais. Without raising her gavel, she asked, "Do we have a second?" A beat of silence. Then Senator Worth, a Republican from Ohio, with a long-standing record of supporting private innovation, cleared his throat. "I second the motion," he said plainly. His tone wasn't theatrical. It was resigned, inevitable. Two more voices followed before the next breath. One Democrat, one independent, and then came the gavel. Three precise, echoing strikes, not symbolic, binding. The resolution was passed. And in that instant, the myth of Elon Musk, the untouchable genius, the world builder above reproach, began to collapse under the gravity of a system he could not algorithm his way out of. The headlines were immediate, cascading like aftershocks through digital networks. Congress launches formal investigation into Musk's environmental record government to probe health risks from Tesla, SpaceX facilities. Musk summoned for compliance under Federal Health Act, Section 421B. What followed was the procedural equivalent of a noose tightening. The committee voted to authorize full subpoena power, granted to independent, federally appointed environmental scientists, epidemiologists, and public health attorneys. No internal review boards, no corporate hired consultants, no sealed settlements. Jasmine had made it clear in her proposal. This investigation would involve direct field testing, on-site inspections of Musk's industrial complexes, and full release of internal memos, incident reports, environmental audits, and employee medical records dating back at least 10 years. Every cough, every leak, every chemical used, every silence bought. And for the first time, Elon Musk didn't speak. He sat still, fingers folded tightly beneath the table. his mouth a thin line. There were no more jokes, no smirks, no jabs about poetry and rocket science. The room, which had once bent slightly toward his gravity, had turned on its axis. And the pressure wasn't coming from just one woman anymore. It was coming from the system he had always dismissed as slower, weaker, irrelevant. Now it was breathing down his neck. The injustice Jasmine had carried alone for the first half of the hearing had erupted into collective outrage. Lawmakers who once hesitated now voiced calls for transparency. Reporters surged from their benches, thumbs flying over phone screens, eyes wide as the story exploded in real time. Outside, protests that had begun as quiet picket lines outside the Capitol gates grew louder. One banner read, "Progress without poison." Another, "We are not your collateral." And as the official terms of the investigation were read into the record, complete with federal enforcement clauses and a 90-day compliance deadline, Musk looked not like a visionary under siege, but like a man finally pulled from the future and made to answer for the present. The chairwoman turned her attention back to him one final time. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice like stone, "you will be expected to comply fully with this order. Any attempt to obstruct, withhold, or delay access to information will be considered grounds for contempt under federal code. This is not a request, it is law." Still, Musk said nothing. Jasmine Crockett, seated once more but unbowed, looked at him, not with triumph, but with the grim recognition of what it took to get here. It had taken mothers crying in front of microphones, doctors risking careers to speak the truth, a child's photograph laid bare beside quarterly reports. It had taken everything, and still the cost was incalculable. But now the wheels were turning, not to punish for punishment's sake, but to reclaim a truth lost in the noise of ambition, that no man, no matter how powerful, gets to soar above the law while others choke on the dust his empire leaves behind. And as the gavel fell and the investigation was set in motion, something even more unstoppable began to stir. Not within the marble walls of Congress, but far beyond them. The halls of power had moved. Now the streets would rise. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the border town of Brownsville, Texas, where mothers gathered in a church basement across from a SpaceX facility. They had watched for years as the launches roared above them, shaking their walls, rattling their windows, and coating their gardens in a fine layer of dust no one could explain. Their children were coughing more. Rashes were appearing. Local clinics had no answers. That night they passed around manila folders, medical records, soil samples, ultrasound scans. One woman stood up and whispered, "Enough." The next morning, they filed the first class action lawsuit against Elon Musk's companies, citing environmental negligence, chemical exposure, and long-term health deterioration. Within 48 hours, it had been joined by more than 700 residents and counting. News of the lawsuit spread like fire through dry brush. In Sparks, Nevada, former employees of the Tesla Gigafactory, many of whom had signed NDAs years prior, began speaking to legal representatives under whistleblower protections. One man came forward with documented reports of internal safety violations buried by management. Another had images of corroded ventilation systems coated in particulate matter. A third had his son's medical records, age 6, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. "We never had cancer in our family," he told a reporter. Then came the factory. By the end of the week, multiple legal teams, environmental justice firms, labor rights groups, and medical advocacy coalitions had merged into a national legal front. Their name, the Clean Earth Accountability Network. Their mission, to take Elon Musk and every corporate entity tied to him to court. Across the country, the response became kinetic. In Fremont, California, protesters formed a human chain around Tesla's plant gates, blocking morning shipments. Many of them weren't activists. They were teachers, retired nurses, warehouse workers, and teenage students holding handmade signs that read, "Innovation Immunity," and "We breathe what you profit from." In Delano, New Mexico, a mobile billboard drove through neighborhoods showing side-by-side images, one of a shiny Tesla Model X, the other of a 9-year-old girl on a ventilator. Beneath it read the words, "She never consented." The protest grew bolder. In Chicago, hundreds staged a die-in at a Tesla showroom, lying still on the floor for 7 minutes, each minute representing a community on the current investigation docket. In New York, thousands marched across the Brooklyn Bridge, holding black and white portraits of children who had died near suspected contamination zones. In Atlanta, a group hacked a billboard above the downtown connector to flash, "Elon, we're not disposable." Pressure mounted in every direction. State attorneys general from California, Texas, and New Mexico announced they would be reviewing potential violations of state-level environmental codes. Health departments in multiple counties released open letters warning residents to avoid contact with groundwater near known facilities. Insurance companies quietly began reassessing liability exposure for property owners near musk-linked zones, spooking real estate markets and panicking investors. Meanwhile, independent environmental watchdogs launched new investigations, using infrared drones, air quality balloons, and soil analysis to document conditions around every single musk operation on U.S. soil. And through it all, the human stories flooded in. Parents clutching photographs, workers with oxygen tanks, teachers showing charts of unexplained absences, tribal leaders demanding restitution for land poisoned without consultation. Children too young to testify, but old enough to bear the scars. It wasn't a campaign, it was a wave. And Jasmine Crockett's name was now chanted beside theirs, not as a savior, but as a spark. One mother said it on national television. "We saw what she did in that hearing. She didn't just speak for us, she made us speak for ourselves." Musk's team scrambled to respond. Press conferences were hastily organized. PR campaigns were reactivated. A new ad aired during prime time. Slow shots of solar panels, children running through wind farms, a gentle narrator saying, "We build for a better tomorrow." But by then, the truth had legs. The voices were louder. The lawsuits were multiplying, and the protests had gone global. Demonstrations sparked in Berlin, Shanghai, Cape Town. All different languages, all the same chant. "We are not the cost of progress." And somewhere in the center of it, the man who once promised to save the planet was now being asked to answer for how much of it he had already sacrificed. And as the lawsuits stacked, the protests surged, and headlines no longer bent in his favor, the pressure reached a point no engineer could calculate, no algorithm could diffuse. Elon Musk, for the first time in years, was forced to stop talking and start listening. He appeared at a hastily assembled press conference in Austin, Texas. No flashy stage, no gleaming prototype behind him, just a podium, a federal flag, and eyes that for once were not worshipful, but waiting. The man who once dismissed criticism as noise now stood behind a microphone, flanked by silence, not applause. Cameras snapped. Protesters outside chanted his name with fury, not awe. He adjusted his collar, exhaled slowly, and looked down at the speech in his hands as if the weight of it might crush the empire he built. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, not because they feared what he might do, but because they didn't know if he was capable of humility. But then he spoke, measured, uncharacteristically subdued, with none of the bravado that usually defined him. "There's no innovation," he began, "that is worth the price of a child's health." The sentence dropped like steel into a sea of noise. Even the reporters, trained to expect corporate spin, paused. Musk continued, his voice steady but taut. "Over the past several weeks, I've heard voices I should have heard a long time ago. Parents, teachers, factory workers, communities I believed I was helping, but in reality, may have harmed." He looked up then, briefly, and the image flicked across every major news network. The world's most famous futurist acknowledging failure. Not in space, but on Earth. "I won't pretend that all the allegations are accurate, and I won't accept every accusation as fact. But I also cannot deny that we have not done enough. Not to test, not to protect, not to listen." Behind him, the projection screen lit up. Not with a Tesla logo, not with a rendering of Mars, but with a stark title, Environmental Restructuring and Public Health Accountability Plan. Effective immediately. Musk stepped aside as a representative from the new task force. An independent coalition formed from government watchdogs, climate scientists, union health advocates, and third-party auditors approached the mic. She listed the details: a full internal review of all Tesla and SpaceX facilities, permanent air and water quality monitoring installed at every production and launch site, creation of a compensation fund for families with medically confirmed exposure-linked illnesses, and the complete suspension of operations at 3 specific plants until federal safety standards could be independently verified and met. The crowd outside roared, not in celebration, but in something closer to catharsis. Musk returned to the podium. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about responsibility. I built my companies to solve problems. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as part of that equation. That changes today." He promised sweeping changes to facility design, transitioning to enclosed systems that reduce airborne particulate emissions by over 80%, based on peer-reviewed filtration tech previously deemed too expensive. Battery production lines would be relocated away from residential zones, with local governments given oversight authority over zoning decisions. All environmental reports would now be made public in real time, accessible to anyone via an open data portal developed in partnership with civic tech groups. Furthermore, Musk announced the launch of a $1.2 billion Community Impact and Environmental Justice Fund, a pool financed by direct stock allocation from Tesla and SpaceX executive bonuses over the next 3 years, earmarked for remediation, healthcare, and legal assistance. And yet, even as the room began to shift, reporters softening, advisors nodding, Musk did not let himself off the hook. "There are children," he said, "already buried. There are lungs that will never fully recover. No amount of restructuring undoes that. But I hope what we do next can stop the suffering we've ignored or denied or calculated as an acceptable margin of risk." He paused, then delivered what would become the line replayed across news segments worldwide. "You cannot build the future by sacrificing the breath of the present." Outside the conference, the mood changed. The chants quieted. Some signs were lowered. A few were held higher. But for Jasmine Crockett, watching not from a seat in Congress, but from a battered community center in New Mexico, surrounded by people whose names never made the news, this wasn't a victory, it was a beginning. She listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, knowing full well that corporate apology, without legal enforcement, was a script America had seen too many times before. But she also knew something had cracked, something structural, something cultural. Musk hadn't conceded because he wanted to. He had conceded because truth, when carried by the people, had finally become too heavy to ignore. In the weeks that followed, the changes rolled out. Environmental task forces descended on sites long closed to the public. Medical clinics began receiving funding for treatment programs that had once been impossible to staff. School districts saw air filters delivered in crates stamped priority. Engineers at Tesla, previously silenced under NDAs, were invited to help redesign facilities with safety, not just speed as their mandate. And across the country, community leaders, some who had never held a microphone in their lives, stepped forward to serve on newly formed advisory councils that would hold the Musk empire to its promises. For the first time, innovation had to answer to humanity. And in boardrooms that once laughed off legislation, in factories where a complaint once meant termination, in towns where breathing had become a risk, there was something else in the air. Accountability, not enough, but real and irreversible. As the noise outside Tesla's gates became a relentless drumbeat of voices demanding justice. Not stock prices, not vision statements, but air that could be breathed and children that could live. The myth of untouchability surrounding Elon Musk began to fracture. The morning air outside Tesla headquarters was thick, not with fog, but with the echoes of protest signs thudding against barricades and chants rising from lungs once silenced by corporate indifference. Across major news networks, footage rolled in from Austin, Reno, Buffalo, Hawthorne, cities once proud to host the Musk empire, now turned into epicenters of a reckoning. The names of the sick were no longer data points. They had become stories, and those stories were impossible to ignore. Behind closed doors, executives whispered urgently. Stockholders panicked. Board members demanded strategy, but none of them were ready for what would come next. Not a legal settlement, not a marketing stunt, but something far more rare, a public surrender from the man who once called himself the architect of humanity's future. Musk stepped onto the press stage in silence. No signature smirk, no AI jokes, Just a grim, pale stillness that said he had finally been cornered. Not by a competitor or market shift, but by consequence. The cameras zoomed in, protesters paused, and then into a microphone that had amplified endless predictions about Mars and cyborgs and digital utopias. Elon Musk said 6 words that stopped time. "We have to do better, immediately." The room exhaled. He continued, "For too long, we've talked about the future as if it were something clean, perfect, and bloodless. But the truth is, progress has casualties, and when those casualties are your neighbors, your kids, your lungs, that's not innovation. That's negligence." The words weren't smooth. They were jagged, stilted, but they were real. For the first time, Musk wasn't selling a product. He was admitting a failure. "I built companies to disrupt industries," he said, "but I refuse to let anyone disrupt me. That stops today." He lifted a document, a policy draft stamped with federal oversight seals and countersigned by members of Congress, including Jasmine Crockett herself. It was titled Sustainable Transition and Community Protection Framework, and it wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a binding set of reforms. Every Tesla and SpaceX facility would undergo environmental reevaluation. Independent scientific audits would no longer be optional. A new cap and account system would publicly log every ounce of pollution and every dollar spent on cleanup in real time. A compensation fund, starting at $750 million, would be created for families with proven exposure to site-related toxins. And perhaps most shocking of all, 3 planned megasites, each projected to net Tesla over $3 billion in revenue, were officially suspended until further public health studies were concluded. "I'm not proud of what brought us here," Musk said, his voice slightly breaking. "But if this is the price of course correction, then I accept it." He was just getting started. As he spoke, a slide behind him changed. Images of lithium extraction pits, once showcased as clean energy triumphs, now shown next to respiratory disease clusters and contaminated aquifers. The screen didn't sell hope. It admitted harm. And that shift, the willingness to reflect instead of deflect, staggered even his fiercest critics. Musk announced the immediate establishment of a new division within Tesla, Tesla Reclamation and Environmental Integrity, staffed not by engineers, but by epidemiologists, sociologists, and environmental justice advocates. Their sole task? To trace every link between Tesla's operations and public health outcomes. Every 6 months, a public hearing would be held. Not a press release, a hearing, with real community testimony, with live-streamed accountability. And it wasn't just Tesla. At SpaceX, launch pads would be redesigned with new noise abatement and pollution containment systems. Rocket fuel storage zones near residential neighborhoods would be relocated. The Boca Chica site, long accused of contaminating water tables, would be jointly managed with local environmental watchdogs and tribal councils. "This is not charity," Musk said. "This is course correction with teeth." Then, turning to the issue of energy, he pledged a shift in Tesla battery sourcing to rely exclusively on suppliers certified under new international labor and ecological standards. No more child labor-mined cobalt. No more rivers poisoned for rare earths. "The excuse that we need to break some eggs to make an omelet," he said. "That was the language of tyrants. I see that now." At that moment, the room shifted again. Not in applause, in disbelief. Could this be real? Some journalists later speculated that Musk had simply lost control of the narrative. Others said it was a strategy pivot wrapped in guilt. But in communities like Fremont, like Sparks, like the Navajo Nation, where kids had coughed for months and mothers had held photos instead of sons, this moment was seismic. Jasmine Crockett, watching remotely with her sleeves rolled and a stack of affidavits still warm from printing, didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, but she nodded, just once, because she knew that public pressure had bent one of the most powerful figures in the world to the will of the people, not through scandal, but through truth backed by science and sorrow. And then came perhaps the most unexpected part of Musk's speech. "I've spent years trying to reach the stars," he said, "but I ignored the ground I stood on. Going forward, no rocket launches unless the community approves it, no factory expansions unless public health experts certify it. No more pretending that efficiency justifies silence. He paused, then added, "And if that means I lose a few billion, so be it. Humanity's future is worthless if it poisons the present." The room froze. His team shifted nervously. But outside, protesters grew quiet. Not out of forgiveness, but recognition. Change had finally spoken in the voice of power. In the hours that followed, social media ignited. Hashtags flipped from Narvi boycott Tesla to Nara hold them to it. Wall Street wobbled, but activists surged. And across America, in the places once buried under silence, you could hear something new. The grinding, rusty sound of accountability, finally starting to move. It wouldn't heal everything, it wouldn't bring back the lost, but it was real, and it had a name: policy, enforced, and irreversible. And as the echoes of Musk's public reckoning reverberated through boardrooms and courtrooms alike, a different kind of figure emerged. Not with wealth, but with willpower. Not with rockets, but with resolve. Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive the storm, she became its architect. In the weeks that followed the congressional showdown, the media tried to shift focus. Some headlines ran with the novelty of Musk's reversal. Others latched onto Wall Street's unease, speculating about Tesla's share price or the logistical delays for SpaceX. But in the communities that had once screamed into the void, the spotlight stayed locked on one name: Jasmine Crockett. Not as a footnote, not as a partisan pawn, but as a force of nature who had stared down one of the most powerful men in the world and refused to flinch. Footage of her final remarks during the hearing flooded social media, re-uploaded in every language. Journalists called her the voice of the invisible. Parents in chemical-laced neighborhoods whispered her name with the same reverence once reserved for doctors or ministers. Children held up handmade signs reading, "Thank you, Jasmine," outside shuttered factories. And perhaps most telling of all, other politicians began quoting her, awkwardly at first, as if still unsure whether this kind of conviction had a place in their sanitized scripts. But Jasmine wasn't waiting for their permission. While others basked in optics, she moved like a fire cutting through bureaucracy. Within 48 hours of the Musk hearing, she filed a proposal for the Community Protection through Corporate Accountability Act, a sweeping bill that would mandate environmental impact disclosures before any new tech infrastructure could be greenlit. It would require ongoing, real-time public reporting of emissions, noise levels, water usage, and human health metrics within a 5-mile radius of every major site. And most radically, it proposed that the communities themselves would have veto power. Not politicians, not executives. People. They called it the Crockett Doctrine. Critics called it radical. Lobbyists called it dangerous. But the public called it overdue. As Jasmine toured the country, Flint, Baton Rouge, Oakland, East St. Louis, she didn't arrive with entourages or polished speeches. She sat in school gymnasiums with leaking ceilings. She met with families over folding tables and paper cups of weak coffee. She didn't talk about the future in buzzwords. She listened to the present in heartbreak. One mother showed her a jar of cloudy water drawn from her kitchen tap. One boy wheezed through a mask while handing her a drawing of his dream, a garden where nothing died. Jasmine took every photo. She shook every hand. But more than anything, she wrote down names. Because policy to her wasn't ink. It was blood. And Washington began to tremble. The tech industry scrambled. PR campaigns ramped up, claiming green innovation. Legal teams fought to stall the bill, inserting loopholes and watered-down clauses. Billionaire PACs funneled millions to oppose her in the next election. But for every ad that painted her as anti-progress, 10 more grassroots groups rose in her defense. Jasmine Crockett had become more than a congresswoman. She was now a movement. Back in D.C., colleagues who once rolled their eyes now leaned in when she spoke. Her floor speeches no longer drew polite silence. They drew standing room crowds. Veteran lawmakers, jaded by decades of compromise, confessed in private that her fire had reminded them why they entered politics in the first place. But it wasn't easy. Behind the scenes, threats poured in. Security had to be tightened. Her staff, mostly young, mostly from communities like the ones she fought for, received anonymous warnings. One morning, a black SUV idled outside her office for 6 hours without explanation. But Jasmine refused to back down. "If they're watching," she said, "make sure they see this." And she taped to her window the names of every sick child she'd met in her travels, one by one, until the glass was no longer clear, but covered in the reasons she fought. Then came the true test, the first vote on the bill. The chamber was packed. Opponents whispered. Allies looked anxious. The air was brittle with tension. Jasmine rose, not with notes, but with resolve. She spoke not of Musk, not of politics, but of a 6-year-old girl in Buffalo named Amina, whose asthma had grown so bad she couldn't sleep lying down. "We don't need more visionaries," Jasmine said. "We need guardians, of breath, of water, of life." The room went still, and then, against all predictions, the first vote passed, not unanimously, but definitively. It was a seismic shift. The bill advanced to committee, and national debate erupted. Talk shows couldn't get enough. College students began citing her speeches in environmental science theses. One senator from Oregon referred to her as the Cassandra who didn't get ignored. But Jasmine dismissed the praise. She wasn't interested in iconography. She was interested in guarantees. So she went further. She launched the Health Equity Oversight Initiative, an independent watchdog funded by public grants and overseen by medical experts with no corporate ties. They would review corporate impact claims, verify health records, and publish quarterly findings accessible to the public. Not locked in PDF files, not buried in bureaucracy, projected on LED screens in community centers, available in 6 languages, updated weekly. "You shouldn't need a PhD," she said, "to know if your child's drinking water is poison." And it resonated. By year's end, 5 states had adopted pilot versions of her doctrine. A growing alliance of young legislators began mirroring her tone, rejecting polished ambiguity for surgical honesty. Jasmine's name appeared on more than just bills. It appeared in poems, in songs, in murals. Still, she never forgot the cost. She visited Amina again, this time with an inhaler, courtesy of a new clinic opened near the neighborhood, funded directly by Musk's reparations fund. The girl smiled. Jasmine cried, not out of joy, but release, because for every policy passed, there were still scars, and she vowed never to mistake political victory for healing. At the United Nations, she delivered a keynote, not on carbon markets or economic incentives, but on pain, on the weaponization of delay, on how every month of inaction meant another child sick, another home emptied, another silence too loud to ignore. "We measure progress in dollars," she said, "but justice has always lived in lungs." The room stood for 5 full minutes, and as the cameras cut away and the world debated what came next, Jasmine Crockett walked off stage, not into celebration, but into another meeting, another fight, another sleepless night beside charts and case files and names. Because the job wasn't over. But for once, the tide was moving, and she was the one pulling it forward. And yet, as the storm quieted and legislation turned into law, what lingered wasn't just victory, it was the aching question behind every triumph. What kind of world had demanded this much pain just to listen? The lesson wasn't written in ink. It wasn't printed in the headline of a major paper or captured in a viral clip. The real lesson, the one that pulsed beneath Jasmine Crockett's every breath, was carved into the bruises of the unheard. It whispered from the walls of crumbling homes built too close to smokestacks. It bled through the silence of families who lost everything to an invisible toxin they couldn't spell but could feel in every cough, every diagnosis, every empty chair at the dinner table. And it shouted in Jasmine's ears every night she tried to sleep but couldn't stop hearing them, the voices of the forgotten. No amount of applause could drown them out. No standing ovation could replace the lives lost before anyone cared to ask why. The humanitarian lesson wasn't about Elon Musk. It wasn't even about power. It was about distance. The distance between those who create and those who endure. Between spreadsheets and suffering. Between technological ambition and the real bodies it scars. Musk had stood before Congress and talked about the big picture, as if progress required collateral. But Jasmine forced the nation to stare at the details, the fine print of injustice that hides behind innovation. And that changed everything, because the truth, the gut-wrenching, breath-stealing truth, was that for decades the poor had been paying the bill for progress. Their lungs absorbed the price of battery factories. Their bloodstreams carried the cost of clean energy. Their neighborhoods were lit by the flickering promise of a better tomorrow, even as their present collapsed under pollution, neglect, and lies. Jasmine knew that if humanity had a future, it couldn't be built on a foundation of sacrifice zones. So she reframed the question, not how do we make things faster, but who gets left behind when we do? Not can we afford environmental regulation, but can a child afford another asthma attack? She challenged a country addicted to convenience to confront its conscience. She asked, what is innovation worth if it comes at the cost of breathing? And for the first time, the room answered with silence. Not dismissal. The humanitarian lesson stretched further than policy. It reached into the personal. Jasmine's own staff, interns raised in trailer parks, aides whose parents had died before 50, watched her dismantle the lie that power belonged only to those who could afford it. They saw her reject cynicism. She didn't posture, didn't perform, she showed up. And that was a revolution in itself, because the world had taught young leaders of color, especially women, that their anger had to be sugar-coated to be heard, that their grief had to be sterilized to be taken seriously. But Jasmine didn't delude herself. She walked into that hearing with fire in her chest and sorrow in her eyes and said, this is who I am. This is who you ignored. And this is why I won't let you anymore. She weaponized truth. And in doing so, she taught an entire generation of activists a radical lesson. You do not need permission to protect your people. Beyond the hearing, community organizers took her name into town halls. Mothers referenced her words when demanding safer schools. One teacher in Arizona changed her curriculum to include environmental justice, not as theory, but as lived experience. A rapper in Detroit released a song that sampled Jasmine's voice saying, "We are not disposable." A church in South Texas held a candlelight vigil in front of a Tesla distribution center, reciting the names of local residents who had died of respiratory illnesses. And on the steps of a courthouse in Nevada, a girl not yet old enough to vote held a handmade sign that read, "Progress without mercy is not progress at all." That was the lesson. Not that one woman could change the world alone, but that one woman could ignite the realization that it had to. Jasmine's struggle taught the nation that democracy was not about handshakes in marble corridors. It was about whose pain reached the podium. It revealed how too often corporations were allowed to write the story while the people lived the consequences. And it reminded every person watching that justice isn't theoretical. It's urgent, it's messy, it's fought for in rooms where no camera rolls. And it demands sacrifice, but it also demands vision. Jasmine didn't just want Musk to admit fault. She wanted to show that accountability and advancement weren't enemies, that a world where companies thrived without poisoning communities wasn't just possible, it was necessary. That clean energy didn't mean anything if it only cleaned up headlines. That green innovation had to start with clean hearts. And slowly, that lesson took root. Colleges began rethinking how they taught ethics in engineering. Grant committees started including health impact assessments. Journalists re-examined their coverage of tech moguls, no longer treating them as untouchable visionaries, but as citizens bound to the public good. And perhaps most profoundly, regular people, those who had long felt invisible, saw themselves reflected in power for the first time, not as charity cases, but as truth-tellers. Jasmine didn't offer empty hope. She offered a blueprint for resistance, for accountability, for a kind of future where people didn't have to beg just to survive the dreams of the rich. She showed the world that courage wasn't found in press releases or branding. It was found in telling the truth when it was least convenient. It was found in sitting across from a billionaire and saying, "Your vision ends where our lives begin." That was the humanitarian lesson. That progress must be rooted in humanity, not hover above it. That numbers don't bleed, but people do. That if we build a future without consent, without inclusion, without compassion, then we haven't built a future at all. And so the final image wasn't Jasmine holding a gavel or standing behind a podium. It was Jasmine walking alone in the dusk outside a community center, barefoot in the grass, talking to a grandmother whose backyard now had air monitors, thanks to Crockett's bill. The old woman held Jasmine's hand and whispered, "We thought no one saw us." And Jasmine, eyes brimming but voice steady, replied, "I see you. I always have. That is what they won't put in textbooks. That is what they can't monetize. But that is what changed the world." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.